Hello, this is Dan with Orbital Guitars, and welcome to part 2 of this build that I'm calling Bob 1.5. Starting out today by drilling for side dots on the fretboard. I'll follow that up by putting some gold metal flakes into each of the holes because these are not the typical plastic side dots. These are crushed opal side dots, for which I have to carefully select pieces of opal that are roughly the right size and shape to fit into the holes, then fill the remaining space with super glue. Once the superglue has fully cured, I use a file to remove any excess that's protruding from the side of the fretboard. And then it's time for frets. This guitar is getting stainless steel fret wire. My process for stainless steel frets is to start by cutting a length of wire using regular wire cutters rather than flush cutting fret snippers. This way I put less wear onto the fret snippers and they'll last longer. Once I've cut an appropriate length of fret wire, I'll switch to the fret tang nippers to remove a bit of the tang from each end of the fret. After that, I can align the fret with its slot and hammer it into place, then use my fingernail to check that it is fully seated in the slot. And then use the flush cutters to remove the excess from the ends of the frets. I'll repeat the same process for the rest of the frets. Once all the frets are installed, I'll use a file to get the ends perfectly flush with the edges of the fretboard and to bevel the ends of the frets. At this point, I'll put some ebony dust into the open ends of the fret slots, then flood in some thin superglue which will both fill in any gap below the fret itself and fill in the open ends of the fret slots. Of course, sometimes the thin superglue can leak out onto the surface of the fretboard, in which case I need to use a sharp blade to scrape it away. Continuing on with the frets, after checking that the fretboard is straight, I mark the top of each fret with a Sharpie and use a leveling file to level the tops of the frets. I prefer to use a leveling file for stainless steel frets instead of a leveling beam with sandpaper on it because the stainless steel will dull the sandpaper almost immediately and force me to replace the paper every few strokes, whereas this file is perfectly good for working with stainless steel and will have no trouble doing the entire leveling job by itself. Once all of the Sharpie is gone from the tops of the frets, I know that they should all be level, but I still use a fret rocker to double check before moving on to crowning. For the initial crowning, I'm using the Z file from StuMac. If any irregularities are left after I'm done with this file, then I will use a traditional crowning file to correct them. One of the things I really like about the Z file is that it uses a diamond abrasive to do its work instead of the teeth that regular files use. With the rough crowning done, I'll use some 220 grit sandpaper to begin rounding over the frets. And even for this simple of a task, the sandpaper will be dull and ineffective after only about 3 frets. I will also use 220 grit paper to work out file marks or sanding scratches from the tops and sides of the frets. For regular nickel-silver frets, this might be aggressive enough to upset the levelness of the frets, but not for stainless steel. With all the sanding scratches removed, I'll begin polishing the frets by working up through various grades of Scotch-Brite pads. Then, for the bulk of the polishing, I'll use some fret buffing discs in my Dremel. I'll make sure to buff the sides and tops of every fret. And the final step is to rub each fret down with steel wool, which at this point is going to clean away any residue from the buffing wheels more than it's going to add any more polish to the frets. Next, I'll go to my bandsaw and begin to work on the neck profile by removing the excess material from the back. I'll also cut away the excess from the base of the body end. And I'll also take this time to add some wings to the headstock. This is to fix one of the annoyances I have with headless guitars, which is that you can't put them on a wall hanger. So for this guitar I decided to make a headless instrument that you can hang up. I used a couple pieces of tape to hold these in place, then put a clamp on just for good measure. Once the glue is dry, I can cut in the headstock shape, then take it to the spindle sander to refine it. I always put a headstock veneer on all of my builds, and this one will be no exception. I'll saw down a thin piece from the offcut from the fretboard and glue it up to be wide enough for this headstock. Once the glue dries, I roughly cut it to shape. I also wanted to give the wings a little extra strength, so I cut this piece of ash to be a veneer on the back of the headstock. Why ash? Well, because that's what the wings of the body will be made from. I realized the original Bob was made from a single piece of wood, but you didn't really think I was going to do that with Wenge, did you? Besides, the ash serves as a very nice color contrast with the Wenge. With the ebony and ash now glued on, I'll cut away the excess on my bandsaw and tidy it up with the spindle sander. The headless bridge that I have for this build is quite tall, so I need to recess an area at the base of the body for it to sit in so that the action isn't unplayably high. I'll use my router to remove the excess material. Instead of leaving a sharp edge here, I'll use a round rotor bit to create a small curve. After I'm done with the routing, I can go to my drill press and drill the holes for the bridge screws. Now, the wiring for this guitar is going to be a little tricky, so I'm trying to give myself a little bit of a head start by routing this channel up one side, which will hopefully make it easier to get the pickup wire through to where it needs to go. And that brings us to the end of part 2 of this guitar build. Social media links are in the description, as well as my business email and a link to my reverb shop where you can find any of my guitars that are currently up for sale, and some guitar body design routing templates for those who may be interested in building their own versions of my designs. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you for the next installment.